It's hardly noticed by the thousands of cars that pass by it every day. C-470 bisects one of the most historic places in the Denver metro area, possibly in much of Colorado.
Hi, I'm Neil Brown. It was here that a significant series of events was carved more than 150 years ago. Events that helped shape this area.
This is a place where young pioneer Alexander Rooney sought the permission of the Ute Chief Colorado to peacefully settle the land.
And when the Indians started raiding all them down the Front Range, Colorado was the instigator of all that. They left our family alone.
His ranch would see the likes of Buffalo Bill and Alfred Packer. The Rooney family had many stalwart and outstanding, hard-working members, and a few wild renegades as well, which made for some legendary stories. This is the story of a timeless romance, told through the letters of Alexander and his sweetheart Emmeline, who remained in Iowa.
My dear Emmeline, we have staked a claim in California Gulch. We have proceeded to work all avenues. Even with the days so busy, my thoughts turn to you.
And I find peace in knowing that someday the great distance between us will fall away.
There you go. Hop it in there. Hop it in there.
A working ranch for a century and a half. A place where several generations of Rooneys raised cattle, raised their families, and operated several businesses. It all began in 1859. Like many others, Alexander came west to seek the gold that brought feverish settlers here, all in search of the elusive fortune.
Life in Denver in the 1860s was pretty exciting. The gold rush of 1858, 59, 60 attracted some 100,000 people, most of them drifting through Denver, heading west or heading back east. Many were go-backers. They didn't strike it rich, and they headed back. So there was a boom-bust attitude here from the very beginning.
After arriving in Denver City, he went to the post office, like so many others, looking to find a letter from home. But there was no mail.
I took my place behind a long file of men waiting in breathless suspense only to hear the old story. There is no letter for you. I've written 5 letters to you, but have heard nothing from you since I left. I am poor, but I would freely give $20 to hear from you before I left for the mountains again.
Delivery, of course, was by a stagecoach, and the Pikes Peak Overland Express charged extra on top of the U.S. postage. They charged 25 cents a letter delivered.
And when I read the letters between Alec and Emmeline, I realized that I had to go back and read the letters she responded to 2 or 3 letters previous of his. So her letter that I would be reading would be answering one of his letters that were 2 or 3 letters back. And you'd have to try to keep up because they were staggered in time period, as far as timeline goes.
The letters made their way to the Denver Public Library, where they've been since 1982. No one in the family seems to know exactly how they got there.
The first few letters were my favorite letters. Right after he left, he wrote to her several times before she was able to write back to him, because he was traveling, so there was nowhere to write to him until he got to Denver City, and then he told her where to send the letter. In her first letter to him is where she described the dream of wanting to fly to Pikes Peak, and I think that was my favorite letter because in her mind she envisioned what it was like to be out here in the West.
I have taken a good many flights and traveled along the way to Pikes Peak when you did not know that I was there. Sometimes I would drop in when you had encamped for the night to see how you were. Sometimes I go on to
see how things look at the peak and then realize it is no use. I'm back here looking only at shadows. Please don't forget to write. Your letters have inspiration. Yours whenever, M.
Within days of arriving in Denver City, Alexander and members of his party headed west, in what would be a long journey that would separate them.
They were pretty courageous to head out into the mountains where there were still Utes and Arapaho, and many folks were pretty leery of living outside the city of Denver.
They made their way to Oro City, the site of modern-day Leadville, Colorado, and staked a claim in California Gulch, where he and his fellow prospectors began the hard life of mining.
Born and raised right here at the old ranch house. My father and my brothers and I were all born in the same bedroom. So this generation after generation.
Otis was the second of the four boys born on the ranch in the 1930s. They represent the four generations of Rooneys to live on the ranch. Al is the oldest of the boys.
Probably the thing I remember most is the two-track road from Morrison to Highway 40, and how we used to, when we meet someone on the road, well, when it was raining, they had to back up or go forward to be able to pass each other, and being able to stand on the ranch wall, and when a car would come by.
Denver was a distance 15 miles away from the ranch. Then Highway 40, known as Colfax Avenue, was a dirt road. The town closest to the ranch was Morrison. This is where the family shopped and socialized, and the boys went to school. George was the third of the boys.
Mom had a little car. She would drive us over to Morrison, and a lot of times it was, you have to walk home, and which was, what, 2 miles, a mile and a half.
The two-track road to Morrison, later known as Rooney Road, with the hogback to the west and Green Mountain to the east, would become Rooney Valley. But before this, Alexander was attracted to this area. It's lost to history the exact time he set eyes on the valley. What we do know is that he had many miles of travels before he settled here. By the fall of 1860, Alexander had been in Oro City for only a few months. Although he never found gold, he had a keen mind for business, and soon he began hauling freight for those looking for gold. But at more than 10,000 feet, the altitude began to take a toll on his health. This was a lonely time for him, away from Emmeline and with little communication from Iowa, where she taught school.
Emmeline would have taught in a one-room schoolhouse with children ranging from the age of 3 to 20. She would have made $10 to $14 a month, usually signed 3 to 4 month contracts per season, spring, winter, fall, and summer.
I received 2 letters from you on Friday last, handed to me while in the schoolroom. I knew very quickly who they were from, but had to wait patiently as possible to read them, for the scholars soon would leave for the day.
They constantly wrote back and forth about his mother and his sister, who lived in Walnut Grove also. So she would pass along information about his family and his friends.
You would suppose that our situation would be rather unkind, but it is not as bad as many others. To begin with, we have a very comfortable log cabin, 18 by 25, with a good fireplace and chimney.
We have plenty of flour, sugar, tea, beef, and coffee. I traded my gun for a lot of green corn. You see, we will not starve yet for a while. I use the teams to haul for others, and I draw $6 a load working into the night at times.
Old friends are here, so things are not so bad, but the bare mention of Little Grove makes me think of you and the home I left.
Randy is the great-great-grandson of Alexander. He lives on the original homestead and carries on the Rooney ranching tradition.
Heading over to the southeast pasture where I got all the cows right now, and it's basically feeding time.
The ranch at its largest was 4,000 acres. Today, the ranch is 3 pastures that are divided by C-470 and Alameda, enough to support about 40 head of cattle.
Well, I picked up the mash from one of our breweries that we have contracts with. This particular batch came from Chop House.
The mash, which is a distiller's grain left over from the brewing process, is a concentrated source of protein and allows Randy to raise a very lean and flavorful beef. The beef is highly sought after by Denver's best restaurants. But the remaining pastures have been sold for development, and in the near future, only the ranch and surrounding buildings will remain.
It's bittersweet because it's in your life, it's in your blood, it's what you've done, you know. I mean, generations of doing this. It's like it's a lifestyle that you know, even with all its trials, even with all its you know, heartaches and everything, has a lot of different rewards that, you know, you can never capture or experience or have your kids experience. So that's the tough part about it. The nice thing about all this, though, that I see is that they're taking their time, they're planning it, and they're kind of they're taking the heritage and the historical significance into account. They're not just taking, okay, hey, an opportunity to develop something and just develop it. They're looking at what would be the best land use that fits all the needs and actually respects the area, because there's a lot of heritage in this area.
The original property included Dinosaur Ridge, now a busy and delightful tourist attraction. Dinosaur footprints are still in the exposed rock. In the 1870s, paleontologists were crawling all over the area. Their find was so significant that the dinosaur bones they collected were said to be a first of a series of animals. They gave him $250 for the collection and put Alexander's name on the collection as well. Later reports say the money was exaggerated. He got only $50.
Far back as I can remember, one of my biggest guides, I guess you might say, or my mentor at the ranch here was my grandfather. He taught me how to hunt and how to look for different signs of things in the mountains, you know, looking when we go hunting.
The boys' connection to the past came from their grandfather Otis Albert, who was the first son of Alexander and Emmeline, and it was from him that the boys first heard many of the family legends. Otis was born in 1862. The frontier was still wild, and he had many Indian friends.
I know when Grandpa and I would sit over on the Green Mountain, or on the place called over there called Tony Hill. We'd sit up there and he'd tell me about his friends that he knew when he was growing up. And he said, we're sitting here. He said, I can see the site of 3 of my friends, or 2 or 3 of my friends that were Indians that were buried. And he said that they were within eyesight of where we were at.
He knew where it was, but he was committed not to reveal it, and he never did.
I remember when he finally passed away, he asked me, he says, don't go over to the cemetery and watch them put me in the ground, because they're not sending nothing with me. You know, I will never make it to the happy hunting ground. They're not letting me take any weapons, so he didn't think he was going to make it, and he didn't want me to see him put in the ground like that.
It was October of 1860, and it marked 2 long years of struggle for Alexander. Away from his family and away from Emmeline, he made a decision to travel south in search of whatever came his way.
I left most of my artifacts in the gulch except for the team and a little cash. I must say, my health has improved as I move further south. Take good care of yourself. Do not let our present separation trouble you. Perhaps it is for the best. Look forward to a bright future where there shall be no breaking of those cords of affection.
In New Mexico, he would see the cliff dwellings of Bandelier National Park and the Pueblo community of Pecos National Monument. He would see the clash of cultures and meet Kit Carson.
Dear Emmeline, the city of Taos contains about 5,000 residents, mostly Mexicans of all grades and conditions. The city is all adobe, some of which are whitewashed very nice on the inside, but rather homely on the outside, and is the home of Kit Carson.
The principal amusement is the fandango, or Mexican dance. There are a great many places where they are held. All attend from the youngest to the oldest. They start with women on one side
and men on the other. There are many steps and much whirling, and at the end they promenade to the bar for drinks of whiskey and brandy. They all smoke, men, women, and children.
Christopher Carson, better known as Kit Carson, was an explorer, scout, trapper, and soldier during his 40 years of travels in the West. He was well known to all.
He is below medium height, rather heavy set, and coarse in his manner, and has a southern accent. He has good intellect but is rather deficient in the finer developments. His wife is rather homely, but the children are pretty.
The Civil War had also begun, and the lure of gold put Colorado Territory on the map, and a place where some of the conflict would be focused. Even so, some of the letters between Alexander and Emmeline revealed the deep emotion that tore the North and South apart in the 1860s.
There were a lot of conversations between the two of them about the Civil War because there were a lot of men who they both knew from their hometown who went to the war. And so he would write a letter asking her about certain people, and she would respond with so-and-so went to serve, so-and-so didn't, and different things like that. So there was a lot of conversation regarding personal viewpoints even. He had a couple of viewpoints that he made her know, aware of, that he didn't like the war. Basically, he didn't like the war.
I presume you think that I'm patriotic, and that is true. When I hear of the proceedings of the Confederacy, to think that our capital and our glorious land should be trodden and destroyed by rebels who have lived and enjoyed our government all their lives is poison to me. Yours, Emmeline.
Things are dull in the little village. I get a southern newspaper, but it affords me no consolation as to the threats against our glorious republic. We have such privilege to worship God as our conscience desires, and may we see the end of that cursed institution of slavery.
Alexander returned to Colorado in June of 1861. He found that his claim in Leadville had been lost. Then he started what he called the Dairy Ranch near Breckenridge, where he made buttermilk. He remarked about his new location.
I think the climate here is very bad between the snowy ranges. The air is thin, it freezes most every night. The climate at the foot of the mountains near and about Denver City is more to my liking.
By August, he had a plan to bring Emmeline west. Now he was in Denver City, looking for a ranch to winter his stock. This place that he found would be the start of the historic ranch that bears his name. Alexander's ranch now had its start. He was providing for the mining and the U.S. military. The letter with his plan had been sent. Now he waited for Emmeline's response.
My very dear Emmeline, please accept my thanks for yours of this July. Oh yes, it is fresh and sweet in my memory. I believe that our time apart grows short. With that, I'm going to proposition you and yours that soon you will be here in the valley. My affections will be undivided for you.
I did not hesitate in informing Father and Mother. Father said after 2 or 3 days that he could find no objection. Mother was very decided to the negative, but later agreed as long as your affairs were in order.
It was now 1861. Alexander found his ranch. Emmeline had accepted his terms. He would now head back to Iowa. Their 2 years apart would finally come to an end. They were wed March 3rd, 1862.
Probably what happened with the Rooneys happened with a lot of people, where you'd see a nice bit of land and you'd settle on it. They probably just saw a nice site and settle down right there, and then later on legalize it after the Homestead Act passes, and you file for it. And then in 1866, President Andrew Johnson signs your homestead certificate.
Alexander and the Indians worked out an arrangement so that the Indians could use the spring on the property anytime they wanted to. The Indians' loyalty to Alexander spread throughout the tribes. Alexander and his new ranch would be spared the conflict of culture. And it was here at the Inspiration Tree that Chief Colorado and his band would come to seek spiritual guidance. Then they'd go down the hill to the Medicine Spring to use the clay and rejuvenate themselves.
The way the family got along with the Indians was that they asked permission to live on their land. And consequently, when the Indians started raiding all up down the Front Range, Colorado was the instigator of all that. They left our family alone because they had more or less agreement with each other.
This area right here is where the water from the artesian springs came out, right by the base of that big cottonwood tree, and it flowed right on down into a pond here. That's where the Indians would get in and get the gray clay, and that's what they call Medicine Springs.
The only stories I ever heard about Chief Colorado were handed down from my dad and for Grandpa. Evidently, he was a large person, about probably close to 300 pounds. And he would come in here and sit down at the table with the family, eat half the food off the table, and then go out and lay down and go to sleep for a day or two. And then he had a council tree up on the hog back here, big old pine tree that the roots came out on the ground, and they would sit there and have their council. And we used that for years as a place for dancing and stuff.
Usually on weekends, especially during the summers, when we were little, my grandpa, he called them doings. You know, there'd be parties up here, square dances, and at least once a year he'd have a play that we'd all participate in, and to where we'd dress up like little Indians. Primarily on this spot here, you know, since it is an actual documented council location for the Ute Indians, is to preserve this, you know, and maybe even, restore it even some more as an historical site.
Stories that are passed on from generation to generation are sometimes embellished.
My brother Al and I got different versions on a couple of different stories.
And there's a great many stories out of that letters and folklore about the Rooneys. And one of my favorite is about little Nora, their red-headed daughter.
I know Aunt Nora, Grandpa's sister, was taken when she was a baby by the Indians, and they wanted a white baby, and they were going to leave a little one there behind when they took her. And then my grandmother, her great-grandmother, went after him with a 10-gauge shotgun and chased him down and took the baby back. And they said that they were glad to get rid of it because it cried all the time. Now that's the story that I heard.
One of the most documented stories is of Edna Bell. She was born to Otis Albert and Christina in 1901. She was a championship-level horse rider. She was so good that Buffalo Bill tried to get her to join his show.
She loved horses. She had a knack with horses. She could get in a corral with mean horses and calm them down, and she was just a natural horse person. And my grandfather had her entered in several horse shows around town here, at Lakeside, and Winter Park, I guess, was one, and she took first place, as the cups indicate. She was only about 14 or 15, and he would not let her join Buffalo Bill's show. She was quite a talent, and he really wanted her, apparently, and my grandfather wouldn't let her go.
Tragically, Edna Bell, known as the Little Lady in Blue, died from injuries resulting from a horse accident. She was only 16.
What I understand is that she was riding a young horse, I mean, working with it, and she went underneath a kind of a low-hanging rock or something that hit her in the chest.
It was January 22nd, 1900, when William C. Rooney, who worked as a guard at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City, was stabbed to death in a breakout. Within days, the convicts were captured and hung from a lamppost. The Denver Post noted that it was not a howling mob that had them in hand, but a gathering of determined men with purpose of intent. William was known for his unflinching duty as an officer. He was the son of Emmeline and Alexander. Both Emmeline and Christina were widely known as seers. Al and Otis recall some of the stories.
They'd sit around the table and hold hands and had a little candle in the middle, and they had their regular seance session. And they were sort of really spiritual that way.
I know one time we were sitting in the kitchen down there and having supper, and Grandma says, Alex, she says, go get your father. He's hurt down the road about a mile where there's a gully where all the choke cherries are growing. She says, go down there, he's hurt. He needs some help. It was dark, so Dad and I went with him. I don't know why I happened to go, but I went with him in an old truck he had. And we drove down there looking with a flashlight and trying to find there Grandpa was laying down in the gully there. And he'd been hit by a car. And it busted up his legs and his shoulder and ribs, and he was laying down there, and he's still alive. And we carried him up there and brought him up home and called Dr. Luce down in Morrison to come up. And I remember Dad asked Mom, Grandma, he says, Mother, he says, how did you know Dad was down there? She says, Toby, the dog, told me.
In 1905, Teddy Roosevelt came west to hunt. His trip to Glenwood Springs was well documented. There is a story that he stopped by the ranch to hunt as well. Al recalls what he heard.
Dad had, we had a kettle that you put over a campfire, a big granite-colored kettle, and Dad had written on it Teddy Roosevelt across it, and he claimed that he came there on a buffalo hunt one time to the ranch, but my aunt, his sister, my Aunt Ruth, just said that was nothing but a big story, and I never knew really whether it was or not.
Throughout the years, the family was always working some sort of business, finding ways to make money. During the WPA years, even Al was busy supplying the workers.
I'd sell the milk to them for a nickel a bottle, and I had as many as I could get in the wagon, and the time I got up to where the workers were ended, then I'd come back down and pick the bottles up and come back down. And that was the first enterprise I got involved in, was to raise money, and I raised money to give to Dad to buy cement so we could do rock work.
When they had the ceremonies, Grandma sat on just about where Randy's house is here now, on the wall, in a rocking chair, and counted the cars that came by on the way to that reception. There was 37 cars came by that day, and she didn't think there was that many cars in the whole world.
The Rooney family had many stalwart and outstanding members, and a few wild renegades as well, which made for some legendary stories.
I know some of my really colorful characters I knew when I was growing up was my Uncle Elvie.
Elvie Pike. Yeah, that was Aunt Nora's husband, and he was a distant relative of Pike that followed Pike's Peak.
He was really a character. He went down to Morrison, and he'd get with his horse, and he'd get drunk, and he'd go into the saloon there, and he didn't have the money, but he'd tell stories for money and drinks. And one day the town marshal named Lee Merriman came in there, and he told Uncle Elvie, he said, That horse tied up out there to that fire plug is biting people and making a mess out there. He said, you got to get him out of there. Well, Uncle Ole, he always carried two 50 caliber cap and ball pistols. And he told the sheriff, he says, well, and the marshal, he said, okay. He said, went out and got on his horse and he rode it right into Tabor Saloon. Pulled that great big gun out and told the sheriff, the marshal that they walk, and he marched him out of town at gunpoint. And then he was, of course, he was 86 from Morrison. He couldn't go in town, the city limits after that. But he was a character. Boy, he was something else.
It's kind of bittersweet. I'm fifth generation of a ranching family, that settled here in the 1860s. One of the few in the state that has, through the Homestead Act, had the deeds to our places signed by the presidents of the time, Ulysses S. Grant and Andrew Johnson. So, the heritage and the fact that we've actually been able to continue to ranch this property for 150 years, being 15 to 20 miles, west of Denver.
One of the boys' enterprises during the war came when a man they referred to as Mr. Pratt brought his livery stable out to the foothills.
There was a lot of people that did come out and ride, and a lot of business out of that.
That was also when he developed the Skyline Trail on the hogback above their property for the city folk to come out and ride.
And it was during the Second World War. And the Federal Center, the people would come out from there at midnight. They'd pool their money or their gas and come out nice in the summertime and ride moonlight rides. So we'd have to guide them on those.
Their enterprise also fueled some great stories, especially when some of the city slickers from back east came out to experience the Wild West. Al could outride them all, even though he wasn't even a teenager. He remembers one hot shot that came out from New York.
I remember one guy, and he wasn't going to take any orders from just a kid. And I bounced him off his horse. He hit the saddle horn with his privates and mounted on the ground. And the horse wouldn't let him back on, so he had to walk back. And I got reprimanded for that, but it was worth it.
Another time, two nurses from back east came out to ride. One of them was so heavy she couldn't even get on a horse without assistance. When Al spotted a rattlesnake, he stopped and dismounted.
I got that. I thought, boy, really smart. I got that rattlesnake out, and I stepped on it with between the heel and the sole of my foot on the cowboy boots, and had it clamped to the ground. And I took a rock and smashed its head, and they about died with that. Then I picked up the tail and twisted the rattle off and handed it to this one gal, and she fainted and fell off. 200 pounds out there in the pasture, and I said, well, now, I guess I can get her back on. Thought I was pretty stout, so I got down all fours and told her to step on my back and step in the stirrup. She stepped on me and flattened me right out. I said, that isn't going to work. And there was a little washout, a little rivulet there that was about 4 foot deep and maybe 6 feet wide or so. So I got Pat, the horse, down in against the bank and had her go around and step on him from that.
A lot of people wouldn't call a ranch 150 acres a ranch, but, then again, we didn't start that way. We started over 4,500 acres with 40,000 grazing rights. So times have changed in 150 years.
But since change will eventually come, they are at least comforted with the idea that the Rooney Valley Association is committed to preserving all of the history that it can and carefully planning growth to fit in, not overpower. A commitment that will help keep this strategic landmark an indelible part of Colorado's history for generations to come. you.